So I think uh, boxing people, fighters, whatever, people who really study and follow the game will be aware that boxing's all about timing. And some fighters are on the slide, and there's better times to catch people. And Mickey Duff, he people talk about him. John H. Stracey caught Nepal's, never know how to pronounce that name, 75. Perfect timing. He was on the slide. John H. Stracey won. Nepal's never fought again. Obviously, Kirkland Lang beat Duran, the great Roberto Duran. Maybe the greatest performance by a British fighter of all time. Certainly on a foreign soil is Mickey Duff's Lloyd Honeyghan, who went over and beat Don the Cobra Curry. But I personally think that Duff's kind of almost a master plan was when he put his man, Michael Watson, in. I think this was about 89. In with literally, this was actually in the time of a prime Mike Tyson. And Ben, who'd never, I don't think he'd been past the fourth round. He'd certainly never went the distance. Watson had been beat by James Cook. I think he'd had a draw. But, Michael Watson, he's certainly up there for being maybe he's up there with Henry Wharton, Bomber Graham, Kirkland Lang, for being maybe the best to ever win a world title. But the bookies, so I did a little research on that because obviously I did that book. And you could have got 3.5 to 1 on some betting shops on Watson to beat Ben. Most of the money was going on Ben at 2 to 5. Basically, you had to put £5 on to get 2 for those who don't know. And I found the archives. I found an interview on what he said, and he said Ben will come out swinging wild swings. He said Michael will catch them on his hands. Now, Watson was a bit of an expert on a lot of the times boxers would go like that. And I watched an interview once of Chris Eubank, and he said, watching Michael Watson taught me. And if you watch Eubank before Watson, he was like that. But I think the gloves are different these days, but back then you could hold the gloves like that. And basically, Watson, Duff's prediction was Watson would weather the storm and catch all his gloves, catch all the shots on his gloves. And then Michael will knock him out around the halfway mark. Now, anyone who's watched that fight was exactly that. He knocked him out. It was more of I think Ben had exhausted himself. And basically, Michael Watson literally just threw a jab. And Ben, had spent a fortune the day before on his plats. Fight was at Finsbury Park. I remember being with one of Nigel Benn's team a couple of years back. I was talking to him, one interview or something like that. And he said, Duff knew. He said, when we were kind of going through the ropes, Duff was kind of, respectfully clapping, but in the back of his mind, you could tell he was just thinking, I've got your boy. And that's exactly how it played out. And obviously, Watson went on to Mike McCallum, who was an absolute all-time great, a GOAT, certainly in the middleweight division. Just unfortunate he was around the same time as Roy Jones, and kind of James Toney kind of took his shine off him. But obviously, he was a 4-weight division champion. But to think like Michael Watson, Ben, he was a mini Mike Tyson at the time. He was just nobody's raw savage power. Anyone who's kind of looking to sit his son down and show him videos of boxing, you wouldn't really show them videos of Nigel Benn. He didn't really have a jab, but he just made up for it with his power. He was just an absolute savage. And there's an argument really that he was the Britain's certainly most exciting fighter. But yeah, in my opinion, I think that's not spoken of enough. I know there's a Michael Watson film. I think it's out this year. I don't think it's mainly about Eubank and Watson, but that was a marvelous, like, it was planned military position. As I said, I spent a lot of the times, I didn't just record people. I had to research in the archives, and obviously that was a massive, massive fight. And Duff was never worried about Ben's power, or maybe it is a bit too early. And it played out exactly as Mickey Duff said it would. And obviously Watson, he'd lost. He'd had a fought Eubank as well a couple of times in a tragedy, but the People's Champ. And I spoke to Michael Watson a couple of months ago, and I have to. He wouldn't speak to me publicly, and he wouldn't speak to me on record. But what he told me, I'll keep private, because he was good enough to speak to me. But obviously they did have a fallout, and I think maybe Michael Watson was one of. I don't think of anybody else other than. I mean, Mickey Duff just didn't lose, so Watson took him to court, separated. I think it was literally after the Ben fight. What I will say is what Watson told me wasn't too complimentary about Duff. I'll just leave it at that. But I personally think, and I just think this is one of many, many fighters in so many names in Britain that had him to thank. Where I think there's certainly a lot of fighters out there that probably wouldn't have got as far as they did. When Duff was in charge of Henry Wharton, obviously he lost to Ben, then he was brought back, got the Eubank fight, lost that, and then obviously he went to a different route. So it was fought for the WBC, then he fought for the WBO, and then he went for the WBC again. So he had to work his way up. Your Mario Galvanos, your Vincenzo Nadiellos, and obviously it wasn't Duff's fault that Henry lost to Robin Reed. And it's like Bomber Graham. A lot of people think about Bomber Graham and they go, "Oh, he was so unlucky." And that Bomber Graham had a lot of chances to win a world title. Mike McCallum, yes, Sambu Kalimbis, Charles Brewers. There's probably a few more I can think of. I'm sure he had a good 4, maybe even 5, certainly 4. By all means, though, that Bomber Graham was better than a lot of, same as Henry Wharton. But yeah, I personally think that doesn't really get spoken of. And, Duff knew he was a master. I spoke to 50 people for that book, and a lot of them was fighters such as Duke McKenzie. And he said, when he'd lost, Mickey'd bring him back, and there wasn't 4-rounders in them days. 6-rounders, 8-rounders maybe, and he'd put him in, and then he'd put him back on European level, and then and obviously Duke won 3 world titles and actually fought for a 4th, fought Steve Robinson, and that was just a bit too big. But yeah, Mickey Duff, I personally think him, and obviously Ben went away, licked his wounds, and then went over to America, knocked out Aran Barkley and Doug DeWitt, and won another world title, and defended that for a couple of years. But yeah, Mickey Duff put, and I think as well, it's kind of, Ben he won an ABA title in '86, and I think the only person to beat him was 4-time ABA champion Rod Douglas. Now Rod Douglas had won 3 ABAs at light middleweight, and I think he won the one at middleweight. So he'd won 4 altogether. He was an England captain. I know Ben did beat him, but obviously he had a win over Ben. And I think that was out about 42 fights, and I think it was 41 wins, and most of them were knockouts. Obviously he had many years in the army, and he was just an absolute. It was well before my time. It was when I was in primary school, but obviously I've spent a lot of time through the archives and research, and yeah, it was a tremendous gamble to put Watson in, so the bookies said, but not in Mickey Duff's mind. And and as I said, I remember speaking to Nigel's old manager, and I met him a couple of years ago in Mile End, and he was I actually did interview for that book, and I'm sure he did mention he did speak about it a bit in the book, but it was a very brave decision, and for Nigel Benn, what he went on to achieve, and how good could Watson have been? Obviously, he had he's obviously a tragic life, almost life ending, but it was an incredible achievement, and anyone who's if you watch that fight on YouTube, the interviews afterwards, everyone's just like, wow, what a shock. And Mickey Duff's like, well, it wasn't a shock. We knew what was going to happen. But a lot of people will talk about your John S. Tracy's win, your Kirkland Lang beating the great Duran in about 82. Ben losing to Watson was a big shock to certainly the pundits, but not Mickey Duff.